In this story, the protagonist was treated worse than the scum of the earth, and every day was a living hell for Hiragi, as some products of expired rubbers in his class consistently bullied him and sent him on errands out of his own pocket. The worst part was that even Shitu, the seemingly perfect guy of their school, was one of those who picked on Hiragi. Day in, day out, he had to slave his behind at a part-time job, just so he could afford to supply them with snacks. And since there was no telling what those guys would do if he refused, he tried hard to do as they instructed. On some unfortunate days, they would pick up a fight with him for being late, and the leader would beat him up while the rest of the class laughed at him. In his misery, there was always just one person rooting for him, a girl named Shira, who, despite being the prettiest girl in school, was the only one sticking up for a sore loser like himself. However, because Hiragi was worried for her safety, especially because the boys could also come after her, he pushed her and walked away while the clowns laughed out loudly to their heart's content. On a fateful day, Hiragi's entire class, including himself, was strangely reincarnated in a palace, and they were hailed by the royals as heroes who'd subdue the demon lord. Seidu stepped forth and said they were absolutely clueless on how to use their powers, so the queen asked her daughter, Chirel, to tutor them on that. The princess instructed the heroes to look at their status windows so they could be trained according to their strengths. For further clarification, Chirel explained that the status window was a screen that would show them the breakdown of their individual abilities, and simply by saying the word status, they'd be able to view it. Following Seidu's command, everyone but Hiragi called out to the status window, and they were all able to view their stats, and when Hiragi stubbornly gave in, he called upon his status window. On the screen, he found that he possessed significantly overpowered skills, including the titles of Divine Protector and Surpasser of Human Limits. He swiped and found 2 more titles named Blessing from the Gods and Supreme God's Favor, and that he had every single form of magic that could be imagined. This made him sweat like he had been giving backshots the whole day, but a much bigger surprise awaited him, as he learned that all his skills had been boosted to level 10. Hiragi was confused for his heck and thought some hacker had infiltrated the status window, because, come on, even Sung Jinwoo didn't have such perfect stats. In the first place, he wondered why he was blessed by the gods, and then was confused, hoping it was the same thing for everyone else. He asked Shira about her stats, but she just started blushing at him for no reason, as if his magic wand was under her skirt. However, he looked at her screen and found out that she was just a mage. And that was all that was written on her screen, meaning he was the odd one out. He went down his spiral wondering that if this wasn't a bug, then it meant he had the strongest cheats on the entire class. Meanwhile, Shira also asked to see his status window, but she kept scrolling and finding more skills, with a look of surprise that was obvious. She smiled warmly and reminded Hiragi that he was always getting bullied before, but now he'd no longer be a weakling at the mercy of those scoundrels in his class. Their conversation was interrupted by Chirel, who announced that she would be verifying their status screens, and everyone should keep their window open. The potty-mouthed arrogant fool, Seidu, was so confident in his skills that he told her to start with his own screen. While she checked on Seidu's stats, Hiragi swallowed hard because he was nervous and didn't know what to expect. Meanwhile, his mind traveled through time, going back to where it all started. Hiragi initially found himself in a place that one could call heaven, because it was spotless and brighter than his future. But it really all started about a second ago when the entire classroom was engulfed in a strange light, and he suddenly found himself isolated from everyone else. Thereafter, some strange old papa appeared and called him by his name, holding a staff and apologizing for dragging him there without any real warning. Hiragi was terrified, but not as terrified as when he found out that this creep was actually floating. After noticing that he was losing his composure, he pulled himself together and asked the man who he was, and he arose in all his blazing glory, seeing he was God, the most powerful and ruler of all other gods. Hiragi was obviously surprised, so the old man invited him over for tea, so they'd discuss the reason for his summoning. God went on to inform him about 4 major things. The first was that the entire class would be transferred to another world. The second was that Hiragi would be granted cheat abilities so he wouldn't die. The third was that he needed to defeat the demon lord as a hero. And the fourth was that he was the last person in class to hear about everything. Thereafter, God proceeded to grant him his cheat abilities by charging forth his staff, but Hiragi didn't feel any different even after that. Before he could say a word, God wished him luck with his new abilities in the new world and then teleported him to the castle, where he found himself that day. In the present time, the princess had just checked his status window and had a face so flushed that Hiiragi nervously asked whether she was just surprised. However, she said nothing, and he felt he was safe because at least he wasn't weak. Suddenly, he wondered why she went quiet and wanted to know what was on her mind. But she said that she wasn't sure that with such power in his hands, he wouldn't betray and attack them, so she was going to have him executed immediately. Hiiragi couldn't even understand this dumb luck he always had because he just got a fresh start in another world and now he might get executed. However, the princess told him she had a proposal for him and that she wouldn't mention his strength to her parents. He was taken aback by this sudden twist of events and asked her if she wasn't afraid of him. But she said there was nothing like that in the slightest because she possessed a skill called clarity, which allowed her to see through people's intentions. He was curious, so he asked her how his heart looked, and she said that although he had a few dark spots on his heart, his was far purer than the rest of them. To be fair, the other heroes had magnificent skills, but Hiiragi was the strongest and most outstanding of them all. Also, apart from him and a few others, the rest of the heroes had very weird colors in their hearts. After hearing this, he finally understood why she reacted strangely to Seitu. She saw right through his perfect guy act and realized that he was just the devil's sensei. This encouraged Hiiragi to learn how to control his power well. Later that night he was given a majestic-looking room, and it turns out that every other person was given a private room as well. This was thanks to the royals, who had treated them all generously. But back to the matter at hand, Hiiragi needed to understand what the deal was with his stats. He tapped on the title named Blessing of the Gods, and it expanded to show him that all stat growth had been modified and he could use magic of all elements. He realized that these were probably the cheat abilities God bestowed upon him until he saw another one named the Supreme God's Favor. That particular title meant that all his stats were dramatically increased. Every new skill he had would be immediately boosted to the highest level, and he only needed 1/10 of the required experience to level up. Seeing this, he remembered the good, generous God who had given him these cheat abilities and found out that he was now invincible. But suddenly his mind went down a dark tunnel, and he realized that with his cheat abilities, he could get vengeance against all those unfortunate, unloved fellows who bullied him in his school. Anyway, the next day, he woke up early and took a walk through the castle's beautiful garden right before breakfast. In his body, he felt a sensation at his back that represented the core of his magic. He then stretched out his arm and created a little fireball, so he was celebrating his small wins when the princess walked in and asked him what on earth he thought he was doing. He asked her what was wrong and why her face looked like that, and she said it was because he had only arrived the day before but suddenly could already use magic. Innocently, he said he was just trying random stuff and it happened to work. But the princess was super surprised because even the most exceptional mages took 3 weeks before casting their very first spell. On the other hand, with his stats, it wasn't that unexpected, but Hiiragi surprised her all the more when she saw him doubling with water magic on the other hand and realized that he didn't even need an incantation. Now all of this was a surprise to him, even while he played around with his water magic. But the princess gave up, saying she could no longer be surprised anymore at that point. Initially, she was going to train all of the heroes, but she decided that she would personally oversee his own training. He was grateful for her offer, and she said that, even though she didn't look like it, she was the youngest person in history to become a court mage. Well, that was good news, but the better news was that he'd get to squeeze those fatty lumps underneath her dress. He brought his head back in the game and asked if he could see her status screen, and when she showed him, he found a great deal of impressive skills, although they were not as good as his. The lady was flushed and tried to explain that her stats were excellent even by a court mage standards, so he probably wasn't that impressed only because he was too exceptional. Anyway, he apologized to her and told her that he'd be in her care, but at that point there was no other option. Later at the royal castle's dining hall, Hiiragi was searching for the perfect place to get seated when Shira motioned to him and invited him to sit right beside her. He initially felt that it was sus, but she didn't give him a chance to hesitate, grabbed him by the arm and glued his buns right next to her. This attracted a lot of angry, jealous stares because she was the most popular girl in class, and they were dying to be the one sitting right next to her. But Hiiragi couldn't care less and only wanted to eat. However, one of his shameless bullies questioned his audacity to sit right next to Shira. But Hiiragi boldly defended himself, saying he only sat there because she asked him to. However, the red-haired freak grabbed him by the collar and said Hiragi was lying, after which he ordered him to get out of that chair. All this while, Hiragi was processing the fact that his stats were pretty insane and he no longer needed to be scared of the douchebag anymore, so he calmly told him to get his hands off him. This was a shocker to everyone, including Seidu and the bully, so the red-haired dude made a fist and shot him a cold, dark stare, determined to give Hiragi at least 4 windows in his teeth. He warned him and told him not to think he's a tough guy. But right when he threw the punch, Shira intervened and stopped Kanzaki from hurting Hiragi. He eventually withdrew his fist and turned his back, while saying that he would still get even at Hiragi for what he did. Shira checked on Hiragi, who said he was okay and thanked her, but the lady said she did nothing. Besides that, Hiragi was eons of years stronger than Kanzaki, yet he didn't use his power against him, so that made him an amazing guy. Days later, they officially started their special training, and the first week was spent learning about magic in the classroom. But not for Hiragi, because Chirel was giving him up close and personal tutorials in her private garden. One of the lessons demanded that Hiragi hit some targets with his magical powers, so he created a fireball and aimed at all 3 targets. He did an impressive job and roasted the targets unintentionally, so he over-impressed the princess, who said he just went a little overboard and there was no problem. They went ahead to practice some more that very day, so Hiragi made Chirel very wet with his holy water as a token of gratitude for the time she spent teaching him. In return, she invited him to a tea party, and that was all completely weird because he didn't understand her motives. However, her innocent giggles didn't stop him from admiring the flower between her legs. Later that day, Shira asked to sit next to him yet again and kept being nice to him as always, while Kanzaki watched like a jealous dog and stopped asking for trouble. Eventually, 2 weeks passed in their new world, and it was time for Hiragi to join up with his classmates. But the very sight of his bullies made him wish he was born as a trash can instead of having to work with those losers. He was very deep in thought when the princess asked him if he wasn't getting along with the other heroes. He admitted it, but told her that Shira was an ally, unlike the others. The very mention of Shira made the princess so jealous that she grabbed his hands close to her bosom and said she was also his ally. Anyway, his classmates kept training for a while and Hiragi was getting bored. So he joined up with Shira and made Chirel even more jealous. 2 weeks later, it had already been a month since they were awakened into this new world, so their instructor said they had now gotten to a point where their capabilities shouldn't be questioned. He told him that they'd be fighting against the monster, and had to put their very best into their fight, so they were all hyped for battle. That day would be their very first time challenging the dungeon, and Hiragi was glad that they could finally level up, because all the while everyone was stuck at level 1 during their training. Later, Shira asked him if he would like to team up with her, and he immediately accepted her request because, after all, they were instructed to get in teams of 2 for the dungeon, and that worked out for him. But right behind them, Kanzaki showed up and told Shira that instead of a loser like Hiragi, he'd protect her instead. However, Shira said only the dumbest person on earth would ever want to team up with him, and that smeared his ego so deeply in the mud that he ceased to exist for a minute. She immediately grabbed Hiragi's arm and headed straight for the dungeon, but he told her that if she continued to stand up for him, they would eventually come for her. However, she told him that that was far from the reason, and was actually because Kanzaki had confessed to her countless times that he might have seized the award for most rejected simp from you. Just then, they encountered their very first monster, which was a goblin, and Hiragi was so excited to electrocute that one with his voltage bowl. It was safe to say that all the goblins regretted ever being born because he unalived them all at once. Later that night in his room, he checked the status window, hoping he had finally gotten into level 2 that day. But to his utmost shock, he had attained level 37. This was absurd because he only defeated about 3 goblins, so it didn't make sense that he was already level 37. This had to be a reward from his title Blessing of the Gods, which functions to modify the growth of his stats. When he checked the window again, he found that he had obtained new skills, namely, Bloodlust and Weapon Creation. He tapped on the Bloodlust and learned that the skill could petrify his opponent, and based on the stats difference between him and his target, death may also occur. Hiragi knew for sure that it was so dangerous because an average person could drop dead just because of how powerful he was, and so he had to control himself. The next skill was Weapon Creation, granting him the ability to create any weapon from his imagination infinitely. This was also great, but Hiragi feared for his life. knowing he could get into trouble if anyone knew about that ability. Having such strength was great and all, but being the only one in his class with such crazy cheats was beginning to seem so ridiculous to him. Regardless of that, Hiiragi was determined to go as far into the dungeon as he possibly could. Days came and went, and it was already the 5th day of the dungeon exploration. After raiding the dungeon that day, Shira asked Hiiragi what his current level was, and he told her he had gotten to level 100. However, she looked at him like he was just one of these lunatics who escaped the asylum, so he quickly changed it and said he was at level 20, which Shira also said she was at. Deep down, he was glad she believed him because he didn't want her to know his real level, even though he had gotten used to being in the dungeon and raiding it together with Shira. Anyway, he told her that they would be aiming for the 30th floor, but should be very careful because starting from the 21st floor, their enemies would be a lot stronger. They hadn't even gotten far when they encountered their first scary monsters, which were some scary demonic wolves with eyes piercing beyond their souls. The wolves, seeing fresh meat, had already begun salivating and didn't take too long to pounce in their direction. She was panicked, but Hiiragi helped to keep her out of the way and told her to let him take care of things. Initially, he planned on using fire magic to handle the situation, but realized that it would be dangerous because they were in a cave, so for their safety, he decided to use wind magic instead. With the wind, he created powerful, bullet-like gushes of wind with which he knocked down the wolves, subduing them on the spot. By the time they got to the 22nd floor, she was able to handle some of the bats with her own fire magic, and they kept going until they had conquered the 29th floor. Their achievements made Shira really excited because she leveled up by 6 additional levels, and even though Hiiragi leveled up by 100, he just pretended he got the same level up. Now that they'd conquered the 30th floor, Shira felt it was time then to return home, and Hiiragi agreed with her. Thus far, they'd spent a significant amount of time trying to conquer dungeons and had made significant progress, conquering their way to the 50th floor of the dungeon, which was the deepest part of it. They parted the gates of the floor and found nothing but brightness, but Hiiragi felt something moving, and while Shira was being a dumb, slow brunette, Hiiragi quickly covered her and dragged her out the way because standing right behind her was a giant white wolf. It was apparently the boss of that floor and possessed a skill known as the concealment skill. But that was why they were there after all, so he asked Shira if she was ready, and at the same time they both attacked the white wolf, with Shira supporting with magic and Hiiragi launching a direct physical attack using a kick. Once the white wolf was where he wanted it, Hiiragi proceeded to finish it with one power move. However, he was interrupted by Seitu and Kanzaki, who told him not to get in their way because they were the ones to defeat the monster. He told them to go ahead without trying, but as they approached the wolf, it punched the life out of them and they passed out flat. Hiiragi found them to be so pathetic and couldn't believe that it was these same guys who bullied him back then. Anyway, the battle against the white wolf continued, and it charged towards him, so Shira told him to hold up so she could get rid of the wolf. She went on to create some magical crown of arrows right above its head, which pierced into his skin all at once and created the perfect situation for Hiiragi to step in and deliver the finishing blow. As soon as the white wolf was defeated, it gradually disappeared into the atmosphere and left behind a treasure box. They suspected that there could be a reward for the battle they just won inside, and when they opened the box they found the fangs of the wolf. Now that they had gotten their reward, it was time to return to the surface. But Hiiragi saw those 2 idiots lying unconscious on the floor and decided it would be mean to leave them behind. Thereafter, Hiiragi took it upon himself to carry both of them on his shoulders, and while this was so impressive to Shira, Hiiragi had actually used a cheat to lighten their weight. As they reported to the master, he asked what went wrong with Kanzaki and Seitu, so Hiiragi told him that they were defeated by the boss on the 50th floor, which he had successfully defeated. The man was impressed and surprised because that monster was impossible even for 5C ranked adventurers to defeat, but Hiiragi didn't care because it was an easy victory for him. He showed the man the reward they recovered from the treasure chest, and his mouth widened in shock because he recognized it as a rare white wolf fang. Now, Hiiragi didn't know what to use it for, so the man told him he could use it in any way, and if he used it as material, he could make an excellent sword. Hiiragi took his advice and agreed to make a sword with it. But Shira politely declined when he asked her if she wanted one because the only sword she needed was his long, juicy katana. He asked the man if something other than a sword could be made for her, and the man suggested that they could make a pendant, and this time around, Shira agreed to having a pendant. Much later, when Hiiragi returned home, The princess ran over to meet him and invited him over for lunch, where he reported the results of his dungeon exploration. She was rather surprised and impressed that he defeated the White Wolf. But when he said it was achieved with Shira's help, her jealous mode was quickly activated. She asked him how her cake tasted, and he complimented it, saying it was really delicious, so delicious he would want to bury his face in its center. His compliments made her blush, and she told him she made the pastries all by herself, and since he enjoyed them, she would love to keep on making more of them for him. After some days, Hiiragi finally got his first day off, and was pretty excited to finally rest. He wondered if he should stay back and rest since he had nothing better to do. But he just dressed up and decided to leave the room anyway. Right outside the door, he bumped into the princess who had definitely been standing there and waiting for him to show up. She asked what his plans for the day were, and he said he was going to take a walk around town, so she offered to show him around. Later, he walked into town and Hiiragi complimented her look, saying she looked cuter than usual, but she got offended. So he said that it's not as if she was always ugly though. Things should have gotten better, but she kept turning red because he was making her drip down there. Curiously, he asked if it was actually okay for her to leave the palace without a guard, and she said it wasn't new because she had gone out a few times before. He just looked at her because he knew that she had been sneaking around to meet her father's friends, better known as her sugar daddies. She knew what he was thinking. She said she hadn't been sneaking out, and she properly sought permission before leaving. Her response surprised Hiiragi because he thought she read his mind, and he told her it felt like they were totally in sync. All these things that had been said only made her blush some more, so she immediately changed the topic and tried to take him to the cathedral. Getting there, he appreciated how huge it was, and she said it was the biggest one in the country because it was a place where anyone could summon either a spirit or a demon, but only on one occasion. Hiiragi asked her if she had ever summoned one, but she said not really, and that was why she wanted to try it on that day. A priest showed up and told them that the summoning ritual cost 5 copper coins per person, so they paid for 2. He gave them permission to proceed immediately because there weren't many people, and also offered to explain the summoning ritual if they needed to. Chirel politely said there wasn't any need for that because she could handle it all by herself. She then directed Hiiragi, asking him to release his mana into the magic circle, and that the more mana he poured in, the higher the chance of summoning a higher ranked demon or spirit. She offered to go first and directed her mana into the circle, while chanting swimming incantations. Afterwards, a puff of smoke ensued and a cute kitten appeared, whom she named Misha. But Hiiragi was surprised that she summoned a kitten, so she explained that it was actually a spirit. In the spirit hierarchy, the highest was the god tier, followed by the emperor tier, and then the super tier, high tier, and finally the low tier, which was the lowest in the hierarchy, and she sweetly said that her kitten was a high tier spirit. Next up, it was Hiiragi's turn, so he directed his mana into the magical circle and chanted the same words the princess used. But in his own situation, it was no kitten that appeared but an absolutely gob-smacking angel, who referred to him as her master and asked him to name her. Now her request did crazy things to him because he was into master-servant roleplays, but he told her not to call him her master, and then told her his real name. She preferred to call him her lord, better still, daddy, and while the princess watched this, she was deeply shocked and surprised. Hiiragi ended up naming the lady Coco, and she said she loved her name because he could be tickling her Coco whenever he felt like it. He asked her if she also was a spirit, and she said she indeed was, and was even a god-tier spirit, which was the highest rank among spirits. It seemed the princess was only getting more shocked with each new revolution, so he went to check on her, and she whispered in his ear that in the entire world there was only one god-tier spirit, and she happened to be his very own spirit. However, Hiiragi didn't see the big deal in this, and Chirel was so disturbed that he didn't fully grasp the implication of this. On his own end, he was just glad that he now had a strong ally, and realizing that calmed her down. On the way back, he asked her if the king would be okay with the fact that there were extra people returning with them. But she said that would be no problem because the other heroes would have likely successfully summoned their own heroes. It seemed he was just finding that out. But the process told him that there was no need for surprise because he was still the only one who summoned a god-tier spirit. Anyway, he noticed that they were getting so much attention because Coco's wings were so obvious, so he asked her to make them disappear, and instead she made them invisible. It also occurred to him that he had no place to keep Coco, but she said she didn't mind sharing a room with him, and the princess being so jealous and afraid for her position in his bedroom, immediately commanded that that could never happen. This was because a man and woman sharing the same room was abominable. He told her it was just for a night, but she said there were tons of rooms available, and on a lower note, she felt it was unfair that Coco would get to sleep on the same bed with him, while she was left to cuddle her own pillow. The day eventually came to an end and Hiiragi fell flat on his bed, glad to have had so much fun on his outing with the princess, which turned out to be the very first time he ever went out with a girl. Chirel, on the other hand, pushed Coco to her room and wished him good night while he fell in love with her on the spot. But right then he remembered those two losers and realized that the fear he had for them had completely disappeared, and he could achieve his goal of vengeance in this world because he was certainly going to make them suffer some more. That reminded him of his status window, but he hadn't checked in a while. But when it finally opened up, the biggest surprise was waiting for him. He was at level 588, and his skills had shot through the roof, with the addition of one more title named Hatred, Embraced by Revenge. The moment he tapped on it, he learned that that skill could be activated when a certain level of hatred was reached towards his opponent and would increase his current status 10 times at the same time. It would permit him to have his opponent's power and skills, and its effect on the opponent was to strike them with intense pain. This was good news to his ears, although he realized that he just had to be so careful so he wouldn't accidentally unleash that deadly ability on his weak bullies. The next day, Shira was practicing with her magical abilities, particularly her fire magic, with which she attempted to burn some targets. She was proud of herself because she was now at level 50, not knowing she was talking to an actual goat who had attained 10 times a higher level. That particular day was a self-training day because their instructor was out trying to catch himself some buddies, and so they took it upon themselves to sharpen their skills. Unfortunately, no one else showed up for practice because neither the princess nor their instructor, named Gavis, was around, so they took it as a free day. Shira was glad though, because it granted them the opportunity to be alone and probably wind up getting some screaming action. But she noticed her mind was really messed up and tried shaking the thoughts out of her head. Next up, it was Hiiragi's turn to sharpen and test out his magical skills, so he sent out some flames towards the target and yet again burnt them to a crisp. That was his own idea of holding him back, but of course his power was way too high to look like the average Joe's. Shira was surprised and impressed because back in the dungeon, he always relied on and used martial arts to defeat monsters, so she had no idea that he had become this powerful magically. That aside, she also noticed that he had changed and become a more confident guy over time. He said in his past life, he was intimidated by his classmates, but all that fear had gone now. This made her ask him if he now hated those dudes, and he confessed that he despised them to the core, and it was so bad that he wanted to have their heads on a chopping board. Already he felt Shira might hate him for confessing the bitter truth, so he went on to add that he was no hero and that the power he was going to gain would be used for his selfish aims because that's just who he was. However, Shira brought him out of his downward spiral and said that it certainly wasn't who he was. He lifted his face to find her seriously crying and was so surprised and confused, so she explained that that was certainly not the person he was because even in that moment, she was considerate about him, and for that reason she felt he was an amazing person. He thanked her because that was the first time anyone ever said something nice to him, and then he handed her a handkerchief to wipe her tears. That single act reinforced her opinion of him, which was that he was a really kind person. But Hiiragi really felt that the kind person between them both was Shira. 3 days passed since their self-training day, and the princess invited him to her tea party when she returned to the castle. While he licked her ice cream and said her cream tasted like strawberries, he shattered how relaxed he felt while doing it, and she returned the same energy, saying talking to him was so much fun. But suddenly their relaxing afternoon was interrupted by a loud cry for help, which alerted them both as they tried to figure out what was happening. Using his skill known as presence detection, Hiiragi sensed that there were monsters in the castle, who were massive in number. Obviously, they couldn't stay playing tea party anymore, and had to immediately rush to rescue the situation, so Hiiragi told Chirel to stay back. But she insisted on following him because she was the kingdom's princess after all. He agreed and told her to rest assured that if things got dangerous, he'd be there to protect her, and then they set out of the castle. Already, there was blood everywhere and tons of casualties, with the monsters dropping the humans like mosquitoes. One dude was about to meet God, when the princess swiftly blocked and attacked right in front of him using her magical powers. As for Hiiragi, he stood far off and roasted the blood-sucking demons. Chirel got a bit more adventurous with her magic and showed some skin just for the fun of it, making a stone man so hard that he got shattered. On and on the battle went until dusk, and they were completely rid of the monsters, as confirmed by Hiragi using his detection skill. It was relieving that everything was finally over. But there were still unfortunate casualties, and Hiragi blamed himself for not noticing earlier. The princess told him not to blame himself, but he couldn't help it and sincerely apologized for failing to save the knights. At the same time, the other heroes appeared, saying they were there to help, just like Hollywood cops always show up after the chaos. However, they saw that there were no monsters, but only dead or injured knights, and Kanzaki opened his potty mouth to call himself the great hero who had just arrived to find that the party was over without him. His fellow fool, Seitu, said they had literally wasted their time and should just go back already. But Hiragi couldn't believe their lack of empathy, even after seeing so many people dead. He called them out and asked him to at least get their lazy buns to help carry the wounded. But the selfish morons weren't moved in the slightest, and their gang leaders said they had on armors too heavy for them to carry people. Plus, it was a job for scum like Hiragi. From among them, Shira offered to help, and he asked her to help tend to the wounded instead of lifting them, and he also gave the same directive to Chirel. Meanwhile, Kanzaki and his foolish counterpart were on their way out when Hiragi stopped them and asked if they were kidding him because they wouldn't even help the wounded yet dared to call themselves heroes. Seitu told him to stop with his pathetic mumble rap because the emergency they came for had nothing to do with the Demon King, and that meant it wasn't their job or their business. He asked the ridiculous dude if they thought they could save the world without saving people, thinking defeating the Demon King was the only thing that was expected from them. However, his response irritated Seitu, who got pissed, drew out his sword, and then attempted to get a slice of Hiragi's meat. But before he could land that blow, Hiragi's knife was already at his throat. Thereafter, Hiragi warned him to notice the power difference between both of them, and Seitu was really quiet, looking like a defeated idiot. Luckily, the queen's intervention saved his life, and she asked them what was going on, and they were both shocked. But Seitu had this evil smirk on his face and immediately dropped his sword. Next thing he did was ask her to save them because Hiragi suddenly attacked them, and as such, he was the source of the chaos. His lies and betrayal really cut deep, and to make matters worse, their current position made Hiragi seem like the bad guy for real. Hiragi felt angry and betrayed, enough to want to chop Seitu's head off, because he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Immediately defended himself and claimed he was innocent because he really didn't do anything. But Seitu called him a liar and asked the other heroes to confirm his accusations. Without hesitating, the bunch of rubbish heads agreed with him and said Hiragi was a liar and traitor. He got pissed and mad at them because they showed up after the monster invasion was over and still did nothing to help. However, Seitu really outshone the devil in being a pathological liar because he flipped the story around and said it was Hiragi who arrived late and they were the ones who saved everyone else. The queen was dismayed as she listened to their allegations, so she called her daughter to listen to her own side of the story. However, the lady hadn't even landed when Seitu lied again through his nose, saying she was dragged to the battleground and deliberately endangered by Hiragi. The queen was upset when she heard this and asked her daughter if that was what really happened, but Chirel said it was her choice to follow Hiragi, even after he expressed worries about her safety. After taking a moment to ponder upon what she just heard, the queen asked Hiragi to answer her sincerely on the issue and then asked him if he single-handedly took care of the situation. He confessed that it wasn't as she thought because he got assistance from both Chirel and the knights. The queen asked the chief knight to confirm what he was saying, and the man frankly told her that whilst they were struggling against the monsters, Hiragi and the princess rushed to help them. The queen wondered for a minute and said she understood, and then she bowed politely before Hiragi, thanking him for protecting them from the monsters. She said she would like to express her gratitude later to him by fulfilling his MILF fantasies, but Hiragi turned down her generous offer politely. Well, he watched this happening. Seitu was enraged and yelled at the queen, asking her if she was really going to believe Hiragi over him. But the queen said that after considering everything that happened, it didn't seem to her that Hiragi was the one responsible. She also wished him luck in dealing with his inner demons together with his fellow party members because she couldn't care less. Right then, Shira told Hiragi that they had finished treating the wounded, so he sent them both. At the same time, Kanzaki was upset and irritated, saying they should head back because watching Hira and Shira was irritating him. Seitu agreed to leave, but he was obviously burning with rage and had this dark stare, almost as if he was ready to serve vengeance. However, Hiiragi returned the stare, but just then something weird occurred to him, and both girls were confused by his countenance. He asked Shira if it was okay that she was doing all she did and risking getting pushed away by everyone. But she smiled and said it was indeed okay because she had her childhood friend, Isekai'd, with her after all. Thereafter, they said their goodbyes, and it was already nightfall before they knew it. Later, Hiiragi was walking around when Koko called out to him, and he turned to see her fully dressed in a maid's outfit. He asked her what she was up to, and she said she was training to serve him and hoping he will one day bend her over and lift that maid cosplay outfit. She also said she enjoyed being a maid and Hiiragi couldn't complain, so he encouraged her to have fun but call on him if anything happened that needed his immediate attention. She was thankful for his thoughtfulness but said she wouldn't want to bother him. But dude suddenly started sounding like Andrew Tate and said he wanted to be her top G. This immediately melted her and she found herself blushing really hard, even though Hiiragi found it cute. Just then the other palace maids called her to lend a hand and she bowed out to her lord before taking her leave. On his way home, Hiiragi wondered why monsters suddenly appeared in the castle garden because there were no signs that they came from outside. The only possible explanation for this was that someone summoned a massive number of monsters into the castle. He was lost in thought for a moment but brought himself out of it, realizing that thinking alone wouldn't solve the problem, and that he should share his thoughts with the princess when next they meet. The next day, Hiiragi's classmates just had to be peaches and avoided him like he had herpes, but he had already gotten used to this form of maltreatment right from his miserable days in school. He was glad that at least Shira wasn't joining them to ignore his existence, although she was trying to get him not to come closer so the angry girls around her won't chop his head off. He took this as a good sign though, because it meant he could now venture into dungeons alone, and that's all he'd ever wanted. While the others kept being mean, Shira was not so pleased, because she wondered if he'd gone to explore dungeons without her, now that they'd permitted them to explore as individuals. She also wished the entire drama hadn't happened, because by now, he'd have put a baby or two in her. Feeling already lovesick, she wanted badly to see Hiiragi, and didn't even hear when her bestie, Isekai'd, was calling her, until she screamed her lungs out. Already, Isekai'd could tell that Shira's mind was elsewhere, but Shira downplayed it all, saying there was absolutely nothing wrong and that she was really okay. However, Isekai'd took a second to understand her friend's unspoken words and then realized that she was probably thinking about Hiiragi. She asked if Shira really liked Hiiragi, but the lover girl couldn't bring herself to admit it, even though she had turned bright red at the mention of Hiiragi's name. Isekai'd kept teasing her until she could take it no more, and she eventually stopped. But they were suddenly alerted when they overheard the other ladies screaming because of a giant disgusting toad that wanted to stick its long tongue in there, you know where. They were terribly disgusted and all wanted to avoid it, but Shira, without even thinking, chased towards the frog, ignoring all warnings that the frog was extremely dangerous. She responded with a long, boring TED talk about how fighting when it's risky is the only way they'd get stronger, and then she stopped a few feet away from the frog, admired its pot belly, and summoned a great deal of wind magic that encircled them, and then she commanded it to become a blade and cut through the frog. In a flash, that was done, and the frog gradually disappeared, much to the shock of all the ladies watching her. They were really impressed and proud of her, and they thanked her for coming to their rescue. Isekai'd was just as impressed and admitted that she had no idea just how strong Shira had gotten all this while. But Shira told her friend that all anyone needed was a bit of practice, and even she could be stronger. This encouraged the other girls, so they said they also wanted to practice, and they all flocked around Shira, asking if she could teach them magic, and she agreed to. Meanwhile, Hiiragi was in his own world, exploring a dungeon far more dangerous than the one those weak crybaby girls were afraid of. He just defeated some monsters and was getting pretty bored because Shira wasn't there with him to give him some dungeon action. Just then, a small pet dog identifying as a monster walked in with a scroll in a bottle tucked between its teeth, and just when Hiiragi's curiosity was building up, the dog walked in slow-mo, trying to be careful with Hiiragi. Calmly, Hiiragi squatted to its level and promised to do no harm, assuring the dog that he wasn't the enemy. Eventually, the dog got close enough for Hiiragi to pat its head, and when he asked for the bottle in its mouth, the dog obediently released it into his hands. Hiiragi stared at it and discovered that there was something inside, so he popped it open and unrolled it, only to discover that it was a letter. In the letter, there was a message from someone stating that they were trapped on the 100th floor of the dungeon and unable to move, so they were requesting his assistance. He got down and asked the dog if it knew where he could find the person who sent the letter and got a positive response from the dog, meaning it was going to guide him. Immediately, the dog took off like a rocket with speed so crazy it made Hiiragi question his own speed, and they encountered some low-budget goblins on the way. But the dog got rid of them using its magical abilities, and the way Hiiragi saw him in action, he knew it was best not to ever mess with that dog in his life. The dog signaled that they'd arrived at their destination, and Hiiragi looked up to find that they were indeed at the 100th floor of the dungeon. He looked around and saw that the entire place had been reduced to a pile of rubble, and his so-called princess in distress was nowhere to be found. However, the dog started barking at a particular spot, and Hiiragi then wondered if the person who wrote the letter was possibly behind the giant door. He stretched forth his hand and used some magical orb he created to blast through the rubble, clearing the direct pathway to the giant door. The dog kept urging him, so he applied pressure on the gate and opened it, after which he found a blue-haired girl trapped in magical chains. He walked over to her to check that she was okay, because she did seem passed out or sleepy. But the moment he touched one of the chains, a strong electrical-like surge coursed through his hands, and he immediately retracted them. He became curious about the chains and knew that if he wanted to help the lady, he eventually would have to do something about those chains. He used his skill known as ability identification and found out that the chain was a seal chain, which sealed the first person to touch it. To break the seal, a certain amount of magic was required, and since Hiiragi had tons of it, it wasn't a debate for him, so he immediately grabbed onto the chain and began infusing it with his magic. However, he had to pay the price, and his hands served as collateral damage because as he infused his magic, immense levels of power kept coursing through him, causing him pain and making him almost run mad. Eventually, the chain was broken, and the lady fell towards his arms in slow motion. But even though she was unconscious, her lewd side was already taken over, and she ended up hopping directly onto his center of gravity. A few seconds later, she regained consciousness, and when he asked if she was okay, she lost her cool. She started shivering but soon recognized that he actually set her free, so she jumped onto him and thanked him for saving her. Hiiragi could not help himself from getting drawn in by her beauty, so she introduced herself as Yui and then asked him for his name. While he was still dazed, he took her hands and introduced himself as Hiiragi, but she noticed how strange his name was, so he had to tell her that he came from another world. When she heard that he had come in from another world, she asked if that meant he was summoned as a hero. However, Hiiragi told her it wasn't that important to know at that moment, and he only needed to understand why she was chained. Just when she started giving him an answer, her dog ran towards her and began licking her all over, doing all the things that Hiiragi would have wished to do to her. He asked her if the dog belonged to her, and she said it was like her family and was named Peak. Next, Hiiragi asked her about the letter he was carrying, and she told him that she wrote it using a clone the moment she got sealed. That brought him back to his very first question, which was why she was sealed in the first place. But the girl started playing mind games and eventually just confessed that the chain was activated when she tripped and fell flat on her face. Immediately after her confession, she wished a giant hole would just open up beneath her and swallow her up, because she was dying with embarrassment. But again, Hiiragi had to ask her if she was sealed by someone or something like that, and she embarrassingly said yes. Judging from her facial expression and just how clumsy she looked, he wondered if that was what he could expect from members of another world. Back at the royal castle, it was lunchtime for everyone, and Yui was treated to a nice meal, which she gobbled up really fast. She was taken in by its deliciousness and appreciated the royal palace for serving her the most delicious meal of her lifetime. Apparently, she was invited to the palace by Tyrell and would be staying there for quite some time. In return, Yui would be expected to cooperate with the hero party on subjugating the Demon King. While she and Hiiragi had a little chit-chat, the other two girls were boiling with jealousy because they wondered whether she had come to steal their man. They continued the conversation and were only a few inches away from kissing each other, so this only unlocked the princess's inner demons, and she interrupted their conversation. She asked Hiiragi what happened to his hand, and he said it was as a result of the dungeon raid that happened the previous day. So she stood up and started acting petty, saying he should have let her know that he got injured so she'd treat him. She held his hands and began to cast a healing spell on his palm because it was such an easy injury for her to heal. Gradually, her healing light rested upon his wounded palms and slowly got rid of his wounds until there was nothing left. Thereafter, he thanked her and said that this was his very first time receiving healing magic. and the princess's magic felt so comforting that if he ever got injured again, he'd ask her for help. This time around it was time for everyone else to be jealous of Chirel. Later, Shira pointed out that since Hiragi made it to the 100th floor and even rescued Yui, his adventurer rank had now gotten to S rank or higher. Yui affirmed this and sincerely said that she was kind of jealous even though she was just a few levels away from getting into S rank as well. Hiragi encouraged her, saying that she was getting there soon and one day, she'd eventually arrive there. She asked if he could accompany her to the 100th floor, and he said for sure she was good as long as he was beside her and that exploring with her was so much fun anyway. This time around it was the other girl's turn to be jealous of Shira. Hiragi next mentioned that he heard about a certain training Yui would be joining, so she invited him to the 100th floor again since he was going anyway. As they finalized their decision, it seemed Yui won out of the three girls, and the jealousy was evident on Chirel and Shira's faces. Later on, Yui and Hiragi were back at the 100th floor, and she was dropping those monsters like flies, making Hiragi so impressed at her magic. She appreciated him right back and said she had dedicated her entire life to magic, and that she even summoned her pet dog using summoning magic. Hiragi asked her to teach him how to use summon magic too, so she said there was no problem at all, but before that he would have to learn to control his magic first, because his magic was creating more catastrophe and destruction for no good reason. However, she kindly offered to teach him how to control his magic, and that small talk ended there. Back to game mode, they both wondered why the boss for that floor wasn't there even after all the distance they had covered. But Yui was sure that they'd soon get there. Hiragi was curious about the boss on that floor and asked her what kind it was, but you told him it's all down to effing around and finding out. Eventually, they got to another gate, which probably would lead them to the boss, and without knowing what awaited them, they opened the gates. As the gates opened, they saw nothing but pillars inside, but they eventually got deeper into the floor and were almost blinded by a bright light as they got in. However, a cheap DIY dragon appeared from above them, and Hiragi was filled with excitement because he'd never seen one. Yui told him not to let his guard down even though the dragon was a lower class dragon, so he drew up his sword, gathered enough momentum to propel himself towards it, and landed his sword against the dragon's skin. Unfortunately, nothing happened to the dragon, and he almost lost his footing, so he asked Yui what the heck had just happened and why the dragon's body was solid as a rock. She explained that this was due to the tough, scaly nature of dragon scales and that he'd need the appropriate weapon to break through. That wasn't music to Hiragi's ears at all because he only had a sword in his possession, but some idea suddenly occurred to him and he asked Yui to kindly buy him some time. She asked if there was a plan in the works, and he said he did have one, which required about 23 minutes if she could hold out, but she smiled at him and told him not to underestimate her, and then she resumed her magical attacks on the dragon. Meanwhile, Hiragi used the opportunity to get in a quiet zone and meditate, resolving to create a powerful weapon from his imagination since he didn't have one. He gradually began the creation process using the skill named Weapon Creation and soon got a powerful divine blade named Hermes. On the other hand, Yui was doing a really great job stalling the dragon, but she sustained some hits in the process and was lucky that Hiragi showed up at the nick of time. She asked if he was done already, and he confirmed that he was and thanked her for waiting and then joined her to finish off the dragon. Things got serious and Yui started off with intense flame attacks until she completely surrendered the dragon with fire, and then Hiragi stepped in just as the dragon tried to make a run for it. However, spotting Hiragi after he called it out, the dragon dived towards him and with his divine blade, he sliced the dragon on its neck. Surprisingly, that one single hit was all he needed to subdue the dragon, which slowly disappeared, so Yui was so excited that she hopped on his back and rode him to Jiz Town. At the same time, a treasure box appeared and the web was curious and eager to find what was inside. Weirdly, it was just a piece of wyvern meat, and only Yui was really excited about it because Hiragi felt the meat wasn't safe. But she told him that those treasure boxes usually came with preservatives in them, so the meat was safe to consume. Hiragi agreed to take it, so he opened his magical item box and pulled out furniture, after which they set them out for a meal and barbecued the meat. All this time, God had been observing Hiragi, with how lively and energetic he'd always been. But a lesser god asked him why in the first place he gave Hiragi, of all humans, some of their powers and God's divine grace. God responded by asking the lesser god if he had ever seen Hiragi's life, and the guy said yes, so he asked him what he thought in general. The lesser god said he felt the boy was living a terrible and pathetic life because he had gotten to a point where he had given up on living. However, the lesser god also pointed out that there were tons of people living miserably like him in the world, yet God still chose him out of them all. God said that was why he was interested in Hiiragi, and because he also wanted to repay him for something he did back then. At this point, the lesser god was confused because he didn't know what it was that Hiiragi did. But the supreme god suddenly sounded like Santa Claus with a stroke, saying there was more to it than met the eyes. Back on Earth, Yui and Hiiragi were returning from the dungeons, and Yui seemed to be really excited because of their success in clearing the 100th dungeon floor and defeating the wyvern. As they approached the castle, Shira and the princess were waiting outside and welcomed them from their exploration. Yui asked Shira if she had been waiting for them all the while, but she suddenly became a stammerer because obviously she was waiting for Hiiragi. Meanwhile, Chirel asked him if he was injured, but he said he was okay, but Yui was curious about why Chirel was with Shira, even though she claimed they just bumped into each other. Anyway, Charles said she couldn't stand worrying, and Hiiragi thanked her for worrying about him. But their cuteness became really offensive to the other girls. So, Yui chipped in by asking when Hiiragi would be ready to practice magic control, and Chirel won't let her have him all to herself, so she asked to join in and assist him as well. He gladly accepted her offer, but Yui wasn't too pleased and told him he didn't need 2 teachers to tutor him on magic control. He felt it'll be better to learn from both girls, but Yui vehemently said no to that. While both girls were all over Hiiragi and he enjoyed their company, Shira was isolated from the whole thing, so she chipped in, saying she'd like to learn magic from Hiiragi, while the ladies were teaching him how to control his magic. But at the same time, both ladies rejected her proposal and both offered to teach her magic if that's what she wanted. While the 3 ladies went back and forth in their pettiness, Hiiragi was so confused, asking when they became besties overnight. Meanwhile, God was watching them and asking the creator god what he thought so far, because with a new world and just a little power, Hiiragi's life had completely transformed, showing how interesting humans were in general. The creator god smiled and said he was equally interested in Hiiragi, so he asked the supreme god for permission to grant Hiiragi another ability. Go was curious about his plans, so he asked, and the creator god shared that it was all thanks to his power that Hiiragi was able to create the divine sword Hermes. So to butter Hiiragi's creation abilities, he'd like to give him the power of complete creation to enable Hiiragi create not only weapons, but skills and magical powers. God thought about it and gave the go-ahead for that, because he was pretty confident that Hiiragi won't use this new ability for evil purposes. Right away, the creator god bestowed the new ability upon Hiiragi, and a gentle glow overwhelmed his body, while Peak started barking loudly. Hiiragi was confused about what had just happened, and his reaction alerted the ladies, who were immediately worried about him. They all ganged up in showing him their care, so he was initially startled, but soon smiled and assured them that nothing was wrong. Yui was soon tired and suggested that they go in for some tea, and then they all went in. But Hiiragi was still puzzled about what had flowed into his hands, and when the ladies called upon him once more, their lovely smiles and cute faces made him realize that he was a true Sigma, and the luckiest man alive. But life wasn't always this good, because in the first place, Hiiragi was born to parents who wished they'd never given birth to him, and were absolute hooligans, indulging in all forms of vices and never being present in his life. Hiiragi unfortunately knew that he was never loved by his parents and was nothing short of an ATM, only useful when he could print money for his useless parents. Things weren't better in school either, and this made life pathetic and miserable for Hiiragi. In the present day, Hiiragi had just gotten up from a short nap where he dreamt about his past life, and Chirel tapped him gently to get up and wiped his tears for him. She asked if he was alright, and that was when Hiiragi noticed that he'd been tearing up. So Chirel thought he must have had a terrible nightmare. He said he was again dreaming about his sorry past, so Chirel urged Hai to share when next he had a bad dream, because at least she could assure him that she'd be there for him even though she couldn't do much. She also said her only selfish desire was to see him smile again, so Hiiragi smiled lightly and thanked Chirel for being there for him. Later that day, they walked into town and Hiiragi told Chirel that her outfit looked nice and was a great fit for her, and of course, she blushed to the heavens. On their way, they were joined by Shira and Yui, but Chirel wished those two would get Isekai'd into her ex's bedroom and be stuck with his 2 inches. The ladies apologized for arriving late, and Chirel asked Hiiragi where they were headed for the day, so he said he had a place he wanted to check out. That place was none other than the guild, because he also wanted to get an adventurer's card. Shira said she wanted one too, so that made 2 of them, and before they left, he asked if there was some sort of assessment needed for him to qualify for a card, and the ladies said he only needed to write out some information on a piece of paper. However, he said he couldn't write in the language of the current world, and Shira couldn't either, so Yui and Cherelle offered to handle it for them. They eventually got to the guild and were warmly received by the receptionist, who handed them some forms to fill with regards to the application. Immediately they turned to Category and Yui to do their thing, and the lovely ladies took their application forms and helped to fill them up. They submitted the forms to the receptionist, and after waiting a while, she informed them that their cards were now ready, so they received it and left. The ladies asked next where they should go, so Hiiragi asked Shira if she had been to the cathedral. It seemed she hadn't and didn't even know what they were going to do there, while Yui said she had never gone there either. Just like Princess explained to him, he also told them that they could perform a summoning ritual there once in their lives. So Shira was curious how he knew and asked whether he had done it himself, and he told her she and Cherelle had gone there all by themselves. She felt betrayed and jealous, so Cherelle apologized to her, but she was smiling in a way that showed she didn't actually mean the apology. They later arrived at the giant cathedral again and were received by the priest with an attitude from hell, who recognized Hiiragi and said the summoning ritual could only be performed once. But Hiiragi told him he wasn't the one performing it this time around, and it would be Yui and Shira, so he let them in. Shira went first and stepped into a magical circle, chanting the same words everyone else did, while everyone anticipated what she'd summon. She bent down and picked up a cute puppy, which the princess explained was a lesser spirit, and they asked her to name it, and so she named her dog Sora. A few seconds in, a thick mist occupied the room, and another spirit appeared in the center of the magical circle, which was yet another Emperor tier spirit, just a rank lower than Hiiragi's. The ladies were pretty impressed, as there were only 4 of those in the entire world, and so was Hiiragi. But the moment he opened his mouth, the spirit asked him if he had made a contract with a certain person. He figured out that this person in question was Coco, and he affirmed that he indeed had made a contract with Coco. So this made the spirit girl happy because she felt Coco would be there. Hiiragi, however, told her that Coco wasn't presently there and was instead working as a maid in the royal castle. Now the whole thing was strange to Yui, who was upset and confused about why Hiiragi was chit-chatting with her spirit. But the spirit explained that it was because he had formed a contract with a spirit that was even higher than her. This was shocking to Yui because she then realized that Hiiragi's own spirit was a god-tier spirit who was working as a cheap maid in the palace. Anyway, he asked her what she was going to name her own spirit, and so she gave her the name Lulu. The spirit was pleased with her name and swore to serve Yui faithfully, whom she addressed as her master. Meanwhile, Seitu was having a moment of reflection, which he usually never had in his miserable life, where he realized that he hadn't been having his way as usual for some time now. He felt the only one responsible for this was Hiiragi, and the dude had been acting so cool even when Shira was giving him her entire attention, and he also got to hang out with other ladies. The ignorant doofus felt that all that attention should be rightly his, and that Hiiragi seemed to be getting everything he wanted on a platter. So he was determined never to lose to someone like that, who had always been a loser from the start. Just an idea, according to him, and he planned to take advantage of the fact that Hiiragi was currently not around. Meanwhile, the princess had organized yet another tea party, and Hiiragi joined her on the table, noting that there was a notable difference in the taste of her tea. She was glad he noticed because she put in so much effort and switched some of the herbs, so Hir told her he preferred this version and that it seemed that they were into similar things after all. This made the princess so shy, and she blushed widely, but their little cute moment was interrupted by none other than that baboon. He questioned why Hiiragi was having tea with the princess, so Hiiragi told him it was an already planned date, but Seitu claimed that the princess had promised to have a tea date with him instead. However, when Hiiragi asked her to confirm it, Cherelle said it wasn't true because earlier that day, Seitu had promised himself and taken off on his own like some demon-possessed dude. Here's exactly how it happened. Seitu walked up to Cherelle and asked her out to a tea date, but she politely said she had other plans. He got upset and asked if those plans were with Hiiragi, so she said yes, and he said it wasn't a big deal so she could easily cancel on him. Princess was just trying to process what the idiot was advising her to do, and before she could turn him down, he said he'd come pick her up after training the next day. After listening to the princess's narration, Hiiragi told Seitu that only boys with milk teeth would ever ask a girl out so pathetically. But Seitu responded by saying that obviously the princess would prefer him to Hiiragi, so Chirel warned him not to talk like his brain was leaking, because Hiiragi was a million times better than Seitu, so she should pick him over and over again. That humiliated him so much that he started yelling at her, telling her not to get too cocky because she was a princess, and that she should even be thanking her stars that he was giving her his attention, like she'd die of lack of oxygen if he ever stopped talking to her. Hiiragi was already disgusted at the babblemouth, so he was about to teach him a physical lesson, and was pretty sure that he'd try his best not to unalive Seitu. Gradually he was prepping himself up for action, and Chirel could tell that something dangerous was about to happen. At the same time, his rage had fulfilled the conditions to activate the skill named Hatred Fueled by Vengeance. Hiiragi had already gotten into a dark place. Why he felt that Seitu didn't even deserve to live. But he had his lucky stars to thank when the princess suddenly latched onto him and begged him to restrain himself. He pleaded with her to let go of him, but she refused to and stood there with her arms around his arm, trying her best to avert the tragedy that was coming. Once more, she begged him to stop, and her innocent eyes instantly melted his anger, so he apologized to her and hugged her back. While the two lovers were getting all mushy in his presence, Seitu was overcome by rage and gradually drew out a sword from his magical toolbox, and then he attempted to track them down. However, Hiiragi blocked the sword with one hand and kept the other hand hugging Chirel. He simply pushed him until he fell on his back and passed out in only a few seconds. But Hiiragi realized that this idiot didn't deserve the title of hero, because he was liable to misusing his powers against others for selfish reasons. Chirel immediately agreed with him, so Hiiragi proposed that he'd use his creation ability to strip the loser of everything except his original skills. He immediately activated Plunder on Seitu, and it was done, so all they needed to do was leave him there until he woke up. Thereafter, Chirel thanked him for all he did that day, but he said he was the one who owed her his gratitude because she stopped him from doing something regrettable, and after that, they continued to have tea as lovebirds. When Seitu finds that he's been stripped of his powers, will there be World War III at the palace? If you'd like to find out in part 2, type "Soyboy Unlocked" in the comment section. Leave a thumbs up if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.